The dates most Americans remember: July 4, 1776, for example, work as shorthand for signal events. Change takes place across decades, but individual moments remind us what came before and how we got to where we are. So, with Americans celebrating their country at a time of widespread disagreement about what it stands for, Time asked 25 acclaimed experts in U.S. history to nominate moments that resonate now, moments that just might serve as the mnemonic devices the nation seems to need. Some of their picks are among the most famous days of the past centuries and others are far less famous, but all are relevant today. Explorers bridge the Pacific, 1564-5. The first successful voyage across the Pacific Ocean, from the Americas to Asia and back, occurred in 1564 and 1565. Barely 2 generations after Columbus' more famous voyage, European explorers faced an ocean that was roughly twice as large as the Atlantic and extremely difficult to navigate. This epic passage established the Trans-Pacific link, and no other shipping route has been more successful or lasted longer. Trade brought the continents together and created a seascape around the Pacific Basin that included places like Acapulco, Manila and the coast of California. By the 18th and 19th centuries, American merchants built on these existing connections to launch their own commercial ventures into the Asia-Pacific region, a process that continues today, even as Washington engages in a trade war with China. Georgia law takes Cherokee land, December 20, 1828. In 1828, following the discovery of gold on Cherokee land, the Georgia legislature passed a law extending its jurisdiction over the Cherokee Nation and allowing state surveyors to assess and divide land occupied by Cherokee people. The land was then redistributed, with buildings intact, to white residents via a lottery system, driving Cherokee leaders and their white allies to bring suit against the U.S. government. But, when the U.S. Supreme Court found that Georgia had no authority over the Cherokee government or its populace, President Andrew Jackson refused to enforce the decision. Georgia's coup flouted the law of the land with tacit support from the president, setting the stage for the Federal Indian Removal Act of 1830. Which mandated the forced relocation of native peoples, a cautionary tale about the refusal of a president to respect the courts and the failure of the nation's leaders to protect the rights of indigenous people. J. Marion Sims opens his hospital, 1844, date unknown. Dr. James Marion Sims, a pioneering American gynecologist, is often credited with establishing the country's first women's hospital in Manhattan in 1855, but in fact the Women's Hospital in the state of New York was not the first such institution he opened. In 1844, Sims had his slaves build a women's hospital in Mount Meigs, Alabama, expressly for experimenting on enslaved women who suffered from a common gynecological condition caused from childbirth injuries. Sims' surgical work in Alabama, performed with the assistance of other enslaved patients, whom he trained as nurses, helped to launch his career as one of the country's most famous gynecologists. Even after Sims' death in 1883, the Mount Meigs Hospital was still being used to treat the black population there. Historical retellings of the rise of American gynecology long overlooked the field's intimate connection to American slavery. Today, however, protests emerged over Sims' experimentation on enslaved women and his Central Park statue has been removed to his gravesite.
The Oregon Treaty defines the Canadian border. June 15, 1846. The Oregon Treaty established the United States-Canada border, west of the Rocky Mountains, at the 49th parallel. In the decades prior to the treaty, the U.S. and Great Britain had jointly occupied the region, but, while the boundary settled imperial questions, it also disrupted indigenous homelands and people. In this way, it was not unlike other North American boundaries established by imperial powers without consultation from indigenous groups. Today, this region offers examples of successful co-occupancy that reflect the dynamic past. The U.S. gained extensive natural resources from the 1846 treaty, including the Columbia River, but it now co-manages the waterway with Canada. The two countries are currently modernizing their agreement to reflect contemporary priorities. Meanwhile, during the last decade, the Colville Confederated Tribes of Washington State have successfully fought for recognition of ancestral subsistence rights in British Columbia, reinforcing indigenous perseverance despite national borders. Through these practices, we witness continuity across the span of history. Commodore Perry reaches Tokyo, July 8, 1853. On July 8, 1853, defying Japanese restrictions on international traffic, Commodore Matthew Perry sailed his steam-powered ships into Edo, Tokyo Bay, heavily armed and belching smoke. Although his exercise in gunboat diplomacy culminated in the 1854 Treaty of Kanagawa, establishing trade relations between the U.S. and Japan, Perry deserves less credit for changes in Japanese foreign policy than he has received. Other factors were already in play. He arrived amid the disintegration of the Tokugawa government and simultaneous European commercial overtures, and Perry approached Pacific diplomacy with arrogance and contempt. His insistence that the Japanese trade with the United States hinged on a belief that international commerce was a marker of civilization. He had no sense that military enforcement of this norm diminished its value, or that of the numerous American manufactures he brought as gifts. A missionary who accompanied the trip as an interpreter noted wanly that among those gifts, the six-shooters bestowed by Samuel Colt were likely to be particularly appreciated given their potential to repel foreign aggression. Abraham Lincoln reminds America of its founding principles November 19, 1863, when Abraham Lincoln dedicated a national cemetery for the soldiers who had died at Gettysburg. 4 months after that central battle of the American Civil War, he was not the principal speaker. But no other speech that day has been remembered the way Lincoln's words are. He spoke of the past, of the proposition that all men are created equal on which the Republic was founded. He spoke of the present, of the sacrifices ordinary men in blue had made to vindicate that proposition. And he spoke of a future in which living Americans must continue to dedicate themselves to the great task of preserving that ideal forever. Nothing else anchors the challenges of our present to the intentions of our past more clearly than the Gettysburg Address. Whatever else changes in American life, that proposition does not change, and holding it close is the best guarantee that democracy will endure. Ida B. Wells releases Southern Horrors, October 26, 1892, 4 years before the Supreme Court made segregation the law of the land in Plessy v. Ferguson. Ida B. Wells could see, as most Americans could, that there would be little enforcement of the civil rights laws that had been passed in the wake of the Civil War. After 3 of Wells' friends were murdered by a lynch mob in Memphis, she knew she could not remain silent. So, she methodically, meticulously and forcefully called out the country that was not living up to its ideals of liberty and justice for all. For far too long, we have pushed aside this disturbing chapter of our past. But there is an inspiring story of strength hidden here, one of a woman, far before her time, who used her voice in a way that sent shockwaves across the country and galvanized change. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice opened its doors this April, and in it are 4,400 names of victims lost to the lynching that Wells protested in 1892. I had never heard of Wells before graduate school, never studied lynching in American history, either. Today, I make sure every single one of my students knows her name and studies her work.